Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our Healing Summit, Healing Ourselves, Healing Our World. I am so thrilled today to be interviewing one of my dearest friends on this planet,
Mm,
Catherine Dunne,
mm.
who is a psychologist, psychotherapist, supervisor, ritualist. I love that. We'll have to talk more about that. Movement medicine teacher, an ancestral lineage healing practitioner. She's been working to support people's healing and our collective liberation for 30 years. And she describes her work as rooted in the healing power of being embodied relationship with ourselves, others, and other than humans we share this world with. I love that part. She lives in the foothills outside of Cork in Ireland, but was born and raised in Queens, New York. And we met 20 years ago when
Mhm.
we did herbal training together in Maine.
That's right. Yes.
So it's
Beautiful
so
times.
wonderful to do this with you today.
Oh, thank you. It's a real honor to be here with you and to have this opportunity. So thank you.
So I would love to dive in, just exploring some of your journey from doing more traditional psychotherapeutic work and say a little bit more about that because you've done in-depth work with individuals but also with organizations. I mean,
Mm.
the extent of or spectrum of your work is quite amazing, but then you morphed into really working in some of these other ways. So just share a
Mm.
little bit about your journey with that.
Hmm. Well, it's lovely to hear it echoed back. Is the first thing it's like, oh, did I do all that? um, so I guess I, like many of us, I think my journey started with my own personal inquiry. I grew up in Queens as a first generation American to two Irish immigrant parents. And we kind of grew up with a foot in two worlds because we would go to Ireland to my maternal grandparents for the summers in North Cork. And then, the rest of our lives was on the sixth floor of an apartment in Queens. So two very different worlds. um, and I grew up in the 70s and all of the normal challenges of life, and developmentally there were challenges. Um, my parents separated when I was young. I was a victim of a sexual assault as a young adolescent. Not just the some very challenging pieces, and I think my own nature of trying to make sense of these different worlds, make sense of some of those very strong experiences. So I think from an early age, I was questing to try and make sense of my own world. And at the time, psychology seemed, oh, the best way to do that. So I studied psychology. I longed too, and it's worth saying, from a very young age to return to Ireland, where I've been living for many years now, almost 30 years. My connection with these lands from a very young age um, certainly gave me something, a resonance, a level of resource that I spent a lot, knew I needed to return to. So once I finished my primary degree, I came back to Ireland to study psychology, counseling psychology. And then I went to London and I worked in the front lines with people who were HIV positive or at risk of becoming HIV positive, which back in the early 90s was a significant number of people. And I found myself drawn to working with people on the edges my whole professional life. I worked with that population was made up of primarily intravenous drug users or people working in the sex industry, a lot of crisis work. Um, and so after a couple of years in London, I came back to Ireland and started working at community level, and then got involved in training people to become counselors and therapists at community level. So there was always something driving me, a curiosity about like what's the most potent way to help people heal and become more empowered? What works? um, and I was blessed, I trained with some amazing people, Irv and Miriam Polster, two phenomenal Gestalt therapists in San Diego, that I had the privilege of working with for a couple of years, very intensively. And so I met these other people along the way who were farther along the road and had me really curious, um, and fascinated about what was it, who were the people that felt to me they were thriving, and like really thriving, not just rich or not just successful, but in their spirit thriving. And how'd they get there? What were the components? um and so yeah, I felt like I went almost as far as I could with therapy. I had, a successful practice, thank goodness, and the privilege of accompanying so many people down through the years. And I trained people, and I trained in trauma work, and was dealing with people at frontline trauma situations. And yeah, had the privilege really of accompanying people in very edgy places in terms of the experience of being a human. um,
Beautiful way to put it.
and and I was always also interested. There was a sense that while I identified professionally as a psychologist or psychotherapist, there were other aspects I was always curious about that brought me to, for example, herbal medicine training, that brought me to studying permaculture, and that eventually brought me to conscious dance and movement, and two other really profoundly influencing teachers for me, Yakov and Susanna Darling Khan, who birthed this body of work called movement medicine. And coming into the body and moving while tending my process, or as another level of attending to and moving through my own process. And that there's a strong shamanic element to that work that also really deeply resonated. And I think when I found movement medicine, it was the first time that I started to see these parts of my life, my own spiritual path, my sustainability path, the permaculture and herbal medicine, that had been separate parts of my life. Movement medicine was the first time that there was a sort of an umbrella big enough that I could start to see how it was all part of a whole. And I talk about that time as realizing there were more gears. It was like I'd been driving a car thinking the gearbox was limited, and realizing that, we'll add movement and intention and ritual, all of which I had been engaged in, but
Mm.
bringing them all together all of a sudden was like, oh, more gears. Yeah.
Well, and,
Yeah.
and integrating them into more of a holistic understanding of what is truly deeply healing.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do we just tap in? Because it takes a lot of momentum to shift, wounding that's really gotten hold or gotten in deep, is my experience. Um, and counseling and psychotherapy and the relationship, I think, is super potent. I'm not in any way disregarding that. I still do that work, and that's the primary modality of it. is the relationship. So I'm not disregarding it in any way. And I think many of us who've done that work for a long time know sometimes we really hit limits to what that work can accomplish. And there are many people who've done good, deep psychotherapeutic work for years, and still feel they're not quite getting where they'd like to go, or something hasn't quite moved. And so for me, just broadening out those levels of support and resource and relationship, um, have been key. I'm not saying everything's cured overnight. If you do this, it's done. I don't think there's any bypassing our healing journey, but certainly the more levels and layers of connection, support, and resource we can tap into, my personal experience and my experience of working with others, is the more potent that healing intention can be in helping people to move and live more from their essence, um, than from their wounding.
Oh, it's beautifully said. And it feels as you've really brought together this more holistic way of healing, that the whole theme of embodiment, of
Mhm.
connecting and working it in an embodied way,
Yeah.
and the connection with the earth, not only in the sense of your understanding of herbal medicine and sustainability and permaculture, but that our connection with the earth herself is a part of our healing process.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I think it's, it's interesting, like, even to be able to talk about that, we talk about it as if it's something that we have to add in, when actually it's a little bit, you know, that that conversation about how does a fish know it's wet? I mean, it's like we are of the earth. That's why I like to talk about it in terms more of just remembering
Yes.
it, because it just is. We are made up of what the earth is made up of, that the bones of our ancestors return to the earth, and then we are created out of these molecules and elements, and so we are her, and our food, and the trees that give us our oxygen. There is no separateness, but I believe a lot of our healing work is to just remember that. And one way, the most potent way for me of remembering that, to the extent I know I have a lot more remembering still to do, but has been coming into my body, because my body knows that at some level my body is hungry to remember, how of this earth, and my right relationship to the earth and to the elements.
So beautifully said. And you and I have talked so many times about how much our lives and our paths parallel each other. And such a powerful theme that you're talking about is
Mm,
that, and this is where I think we so resonate, is that a lot of the healing journey is remembering and coming back into relationship with
hmm. For
self,
sure.
right relationship with others, with the earth, with our ancestors, with our
Hmm.
spirit guides, that it is that realization that we're not separate.
For sure. For sure. And coming back to your original question about that journey from sort of more, let's say, conventional psychotherapy to, being open to bringing in more creative ways, and one way you could say of moving through process and getting more resource, whether that's through conscious movement and dance or ritual or bringing in the ancestors. Um, it's it's been a very interesting journey, and can be a little tricky. Like, I know I have have had a journey in myself, to really be able to put that out in the world, that yes, this is really important. We do this because the paradigm we live in, the dominant paradigm, can be quite dismissive of, it can be woo woo, it can be alternative or out there. And it really couldn't be farther from the truth,
Mm.
because actually what we're remembering is our essence, um, and right relationship, which our ancestors, we don't have to go very far back before that was just taken for granted, that we needed to be in touch with the earth and her cycles and her rhythms. And we needed to know from whom we have descended to know who we are. So it's been challenging and also very exciting, because the more I have um, had good support and teachers and guides, and made those connections in my own life, being and healing, the more available um, those realms and perspectives even have been for me in holding space for others. And it starts to become very clear how wounded we are in forgetting those layers, how narrow the world or our perception of ourselves can be, and our expectations of one another. It's like, if all we have to orient to are the people in our lives, that's a lot of pressure on parents, on partners, on friends. It's a lot of expectation of how, what we're going to get, if we have forgotten all these other levels and layers of connection for resource and support that are right here, that our ancestors had integrated into their day to day life not very long ago, but that in our more industrialized paradigm have forgotten.
Well, and you're so beautifully talking about how, as we can open up more to those
Hmm.
relationships and resources, it expands our capacity to come back into connection and heal. And it's so much of what Indigenous people knew, and how
Yep, yep.
crucial that rite of passage was at adolescence, where you let go of the identification with your human parents and your community, and you remember and reconnect at a deeper level with your relationship with Mother Earth and your own spirit guides and animal guides and helpers. So it's an expanding of the sense of the self that we're returning to.
Absolutely. Which there's so many implications for that. One, because we become we start to be able to get a sense of our sort of right sizedness, and by that I mean how powerful we are, um, and also how held we are,
Mm.
in sort of in balance. And I think one of the things about us as humans, not knowing how powerful we are, makes us sometimes a bit dangerous. It's like, we don't, if we see ourselves as really just this individual, not tied to anything, not of anything, not part of anything, we can make ourselves feel, very small, insignificant, powerless. And yet each of us can have such impact, and not knowing the impact we can have or are having, because we can't get a sense of ourselves, our right sizedness, can be really detrimental. Not intentionally, but it's like, if I'm driving a really powerful car, it's important I know what's under the hood. It's important I know, how fast I can go, or how loud I'm being driving through a neighborhood, or and often I think when we are disconnected, our sense of our lack of importance or our lack of significance not only wounds us but sort of wounds all around us. It's like when we all start to remember, and we, or more of us, and we take our rightful place, then I'm more able to be aware of my impact, of my potency, and I can direct that more consciously. And that then gets very exciting.
It's really profound what you're saying, because when we are in that kind of disconnection, which we're
Hmm.
certainly in our modern Western
Yeah.
cultural paradigms now, then we strive for that sense of power and control in ways that are ultimately further disconnecting us from each
Yes.
other,
Hmm.
disconnecting us from the earth. And it's incredibly destructive to
Mm.
ourselves and others when we expand and remember the
Hmm.
deeper essence of who we are, that we are of the earth and we are of the sky. We're made of stardust as well.
Hmm.
Then we
Hmm.
can become co-creators with the cosmos. But
Yeah.
it is about really remembering the fullness and wholeness of who we are and our
Hmm.
interconnectedness with everything.
Yeah. And that's a hard thing to get a sense of, particularly for the first time, sitting in a chair, conversing largely from your head and your mind,
And your conscious mind.
your conscious mind, um, within the framework of the paradigm of whatever paradigm we're inside of. And so that's where things like movement, ritual, um, establishing relationship with our ancestors, for me, begin. There are ways in which we can start to map. How do we start to open up? Because there's lots of ways we can blow ourselves open, right? There are lots of things we can do to get a glimpse of that bigger picture. But how do we, in a sustainable way, without getting blown out, or, staying anchored, present, and in a way, how do we connect with those other realms, if you want to say it that way? How do we open up and expand in a way that we can take whatever experience we have, bring it back, integrate it, and actually step by step become more connected, potent, healed, embodied, all those things that just start making being a human juicier, in my experience.
Absolutely. And I think another key in what you're saying that you and I talk about a lot is there are so many now spiritual practices and traditions that are about that expansion and
Mhm.
movement beyond the ego, beyond the individual
Mhm.
self, but often in ways that aren't grounded or allowing that more full integration of the sense
Exactly.
of self. And you and I have, discussed a lot how important that is to be in that wholeness of being grounded in order to open in those more expansive ways, but then also really doing the deeper integrative work. Otherwise, it
Absolutely.
becomes a spiritual bypass.
Exactly. Exactly. And in fairness to him, Yakov Darling Khan, who would say this a lot, that you have to inhabit, like, this is your real estate. Inhabit it, because if not, squatters will. Whether it's other people's ideas, other people's notions, and also it's great to go out and travel and have an experience and a glimpse, but there needs to be a home to bring it back to. And I agree with you. I think it can happen that understandably we can get seduced by the notion of leaving ourselves for some magnificent experience of oneness. But then, we got to come back home. And if there isn't a home to bring it into, where, and a capacity to integrate and make good use of that experience, then the only alternative is go in search of the next one and the next one. And that's actually more leaving than
Another form of
arriving.
transformation.
Yeah, yeah. So it's it's territory that I feel, um, we need to map, I guess. How do we go from, um, not knowing what's happening in our body, as many of us, I certainly didn't, and still have so much to learn. We have quite a journey to become embodied. It's a process like any healing and growth, largely because we're, in our culture, we're we're not, it's not fostered, our embodiment collectively. um, so coming, that process of continuing to attend to coming into the body, and from that place expanding out and coming back, and expanding out and coming back, it's like building new muscles and new layers of relationship. And for me, one of the greatest gifts of that journey has been, um, a growing sense of real belonging.
Mm.
Uh, in my own life, I mean, there's layers and layers, right? But growing up as an immigrant, the child of immigrants, we didn't quite belong. I was the eldest. I remember my parents, often something would be coming up and I'd go to school to figure out what what do we do, and then bring that information home. So there was a sense of our foreignness on the one hand. But then as children, we'd come back here to Ireland and we were the Yanks coming home. So, and we were different here too. So that sense of being between the worlds, was a very familiar sensation for me. And that hunger for belonging, I think, probably had a lot to do at one level with my, wish to return here and to live on my ancestral lands, which has been very a great gift. And one of the things that I would say is that the deeper I go with this work of strengthening my own relationship with my ancestors, with the lands I live on, which happen to be my ancestral lands for me, but, um, just opening up to where I fit in this bigger picture has been so resourcing. How could we, in that place, it's a lot more difficult to feel alone, because there is this sense of being part of something bigger. And I think for so many of us, that sense of being alone, it can be really crippling. It's
Well,
hard to do this life alone.
and in talking more about the ancestral healing that you do,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
I got an experience of with you, and it was incredibly powerful. It also is a tragedy that in our modern Western cultures, we're so disconnected
Mm.
from that sense of our ancestral lineage. And there
Mhm.
is so
Mhm.
much collective trauma
Mm.
that we've experienced that we carry in our DNA and in our
Mm.
psyches. And I know that you've worked with that just in terms of your Irish lineage, in terms of
Mhm.
the impact of the famine and just the layers of trauma in the cultural and ancestral lineage.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, those,
part
I
of
mean,
what's beautiful in the work that you're doing with the ancestral healing is how do you go far enough back that you're
mm.
able to resource the wisdom and the more grounded, connected resources of that ancestral lineage to pull it forward, not only for your own healing, but for the healing of the ancestral line.
Yeah. 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 And just to say about to Dr. Daniel Four, that's his body of work that I have studied and under him. And it, it's a it's an interesting thing. I mean, so if we just take the Irish story where there, a history of colonization that has had huge impact on all sorts of levels. Um, the remembering that regardless of what has happened in the recent or even distant past, somewhere back there, there's there's wholeness in that line. And in that ancestral work, that's what we orient to. And unfortunately, and we've talked about this, it happens that I was saying to you, people have said to me when they hear, that I'm engaging in ancestral work, think, well, I don't want to know, I don't want to go.
More trauma.
Yeah,
I have enough of my own. I don't need to connect to that.
Slam the door. Which it hurts my heart because my experience is if we orient to the resource, there is so much love and benevolence and blessing and longing to be of resource to those who are, embodying the torch of life in this moment from those wise and well ones. And I'm grateful, to Daniel for a structure that he developed over many, many years of ritual work and paying attention to reconnect to the resource and let those wise and well ones handle, let them take care of the trauma and the wounding. And they have that capacity, evidence is, to bring the wellness down through the line, to bring the healing, and to enable us to come into a resourcing and resourceful relationship with those that have come before us. And truly, in my own life, it's, this is what happened. I've discovered something. It has such an impact on me. I remember years ago, Yakov Darling Khan saying to me, well, do you want to teach movement? And me saying, darn it, I don't have a choice anymore. It's so integral. And it's made such a huge difference in my own process that I can't actually in integrity sit with people and not include it. It's like it just wouldn't be ethical, because there's a way I know in my experience that this can be, you can get more resource. So let's do that to help you, because people work hard. My experience is people work hard at healing themselves and longing to heal and get the other side of what interrupts them or stops them or holds them back. And so, yeah, having
Well,
as much resource as possible is.
and again, it's about remembering our relationships and interconnectedness, because those
Yeah,
ancestors are there wanting to
absolutely.
support us and help us. You know, the earth and the energies of the earth and our spirit guides are wanting to support us, but unless we open to those connections and relationships, we're then spinning and trying to work out our own healing journeys in isolation. And
And
so,
just trying to gather resources. It's like I should be able to do more. If I just try harder, if I just do 10 more therapy sessions, and it's like, oh, somehow we can get caught in how hard it is. Um, and
and
I
how
think,
isolated we are in that.
yeah,
And part of what is so profound in the work that you do, Catherine, is it is intrinsically shamanic. I mean, in so many ways in your life, you've straddled the worlds. You're a liminal one in that sense. And I think the most gifted healers are often those liminal ones who, in different ways in their lives, know what that means to move between the worlds. And it really
Mm,
feels like the ancestral work is moving between this realm and the spirit realm of those ancestors
mm,
who've gone before us. And the movement medicine, I'd love for you to say more about that because it's so deeply shamanic in terms of not only how you use movement to reconnect with your embodiment, but it's about working to remember the rhythms of the cycles of the seasons and of our relationship with the earth and of our own um, interconnectedness with
mm,
all that is.
mm. Yeah, I mean, where to begin? I suppose you said it, rhythm. Rhythm is so central to being alive, whether it's the rhythm of day and night, the rhythm of winter into spring, into summer, into autumn. And one of the strongest ways I've experienced to remember myself to myself is to put my body in motion to music,
Mm,
because music and the rhythm of music, it's like it calls to the rhythm of our being. And we do have, you know, we are the seasons, we are
mm,
we are rhythm. And so moving our bodies to a rhythmic beat or pulse, it doesn't have to be, a very strong, fast one, but just feeling that pulsation. And music is another. Humans have been making music since the beginning of time. Whether it was just two sticks and a rock to bang out a rhythm, it calls to us, or the rhythm of a drum, right? It it awakens our true nature in a way, and gives us something to rest into. And so movement medicine is first and foremost, it's quite a body of work, but at the center of it is the practice. The first practice of movement medicine is one we call awakening the dancer, where you go through the parts of the body and you give each part of the body back to the dancer. The dancer being really your essence, that part of you that's beyond your wounds, your personality, all the things you might identify with, your roles, and inviting, giving permission and an invitation to that part of your body, whether it's your elbow or your fingertips or your head, to move as it feels to move. And that permission, with the support of music and some good guidance, to to find your way into more and more permission and invitation, invites our essence to start moving, to start taking the lead. And just that moment of putting aside the narratives, the stories, um, what defines us from outside in whatever way, and inviting that essence to just move this body in the way it feels fit in this moment,
mm,
it starts a very potent momentum. And that done regularly, it's like it just starts to challenge. We know now in neuroscience that these neural pathways that we establish are can get so strong. And one way of awakening the brain and awakening the possibility of other narratives and other perspectives is through movement while paying attention.
mm. That's beautiful. And part of what you're also describing from a neuropsychological perspective is how critical it is that we're reweaving the right
Absolutely.
brain with the left
Hmm.
brain.
Yes.
Again, we're in modern Western cultures that are so oriented towards left brain, linear
Hmm.
analytical thinking, and the sense that everything is a linear trajectory, when in reality, everything is rhythm and cycles and circles and spirals. And the right brain knows that. And music activates the right brain and opens us to that more expansive, intuitive, spiritual understanding. And then again, we're coming back into more of a sense of wholeness. But the other piece that I love in what you're saying is that it feels like movement medicine is very much about remembering our infinite self, our
Hmm.
soul self, but honoring our embodiment in this manifestation, this
Hmm.
incarnation
Hmm.
of our essence, of our deeper self,
Yeah,
but
for
learning
sure.
how to be sourced from that deeper essence.
Yeah, I mean, in movement medicine, we work with a few different axes. The first one is the body, heart, and mind, you know, and then the past, present, and the future, and then fulfillment, interconnection, and realization. It's called,
Mm,
when that's the star meditation, when we're kind of orienting ourselves to all of these axes. And for sure, the body, heart, mind is first, body, heart, mind, rooted in the earth, extended up to the sky, as you so beautifully spoke of. And it's like from here then we can travel out
mm,
and come back, but the come back is a big part. um so yeah, I mean, movement medicine, it's a modality, and like any modality you can take it all kinds of places. There's a lot of beautiful resourcing. It's born out of, a shamanic tradition, an ecstatic dance tradition, and a therapeutic tradition. There's a lot of rich, a lot of modalities that reflect the wisdom we have been able to gather at this point in time, sit very well in those maps and are present in those maps. What we know about neuroscience, what we know about therapeutic process, and what we know about shamanic practices and indigenous people's traditions, whether it was called shamanic or not. I mean, there were things I know my great grandmother knew. I'd say she never heard that word, but there were things she knew about how important it was, even my grandmother, about being in right relationship with the dead, with the natural world she lived in. Because I think sometimes, and this might be mine, that when we start shamanic can make it other. And I feel really
mm,
strongly, whatever we called it, in this part of the world, in Ireland, you do not have to go back far. There are still living people with memories and that kind of a cosmology of acknowledging um, the other than human world and its power. To this day, in farms in Ireland, no farmer will touch a fairy fort, because it's still very widely agreed that you wouldn't disturb the she or the Dina Niushla, the wise ones, the noble ones. They have many names in the Irish language, but yeah, so it's the remnants of that remembering, are right there.
yes, I still have such vivid memories of my first trip to Ireland, which was
Hmm.
a journey I did on my own, traveling to the ancient sacred sites across the landscape. But when I landed and got out of the plane, my immediate instinct was I wanted to just drop down on my knees and kiss the soil.
Mhm.
There was such a sense there of that energetic and um, spiritual understanding of our deep connection with the land and the
Hmm.
energies of the land and the spirits of the land had not been severed there.
Mm.
In there's so many other parts of the world, and in so much of where I've lived in the States, it's so hard to find that
Mm.
connection
Mm.
because the land and people's experience on the land has been so disconnected, and the land has
Mm.
often been so damaged or
Mm.
polluted or destroyed. But it's still so strong there in Ireland. You can feel it.
Yeah, I mean, it here too. It's been wounded, but I think it is true that if there was a long standing tradition, and there are some places that are still uninterrupted, some of which we've been to. I know together, some primordial woodlands that are still, this whole island was covered in woods pre-colonization, and it's not now, but there are still little pockets of those woodlands that have been untouched, and many of them incorporate or have within them places of worship. So there are places that people have been going,
Mm.
to bring their intentions and their prayers, and to ask for help for millennia that are still intact. And I think that does help, that sense. And yeah, and people not so far back, like I say, my grandmother's sister, who I knew longer because my grandmother died, my maternal grandmother, when I was quite young, but her sister, her younger sister, my Auntie Sheila, um, was alive until I was almost 30. And really, just knowing her, someone who had such, I mean, the change that she saw in her lifetime in terms of how people lived in this land, on this land, happened quite quickly, relatively. I mean, when she was a child, even when my mother was a child, my mother is 81, and she remembers my grandmother cooking just over an open fire.
Mm.
Like that was how they cooked, and that was how and we can, it's interesting. I mean, that can represent poverty or deprivation in one story, but in another narrative, you knew a lot about fire and you were in relationship with fire because eating and feeding your family and staying warm depended on you and that fire and how you were tending it. So it's close in our memory in this part of the world, which maybe does help.
So another facet before we close,
Hmm.
our this healing summit is about healing ourselves, healing our world. And
Mm.
in what you're saying, it feels as we can heal and expand and make these connections, healing connections with the earth, with the other realms, with our ancestors, and
Mm.
embody it, then we emanate that healing energy for others, that it's
Hmm.
helping restore the broken threads in our connections with each other and healing some of the trauma that we carry collectively that we reenact
Mm.
on each other. Would
Hmm.
that be your sense of how this has a ripple effect then?
Absolutely. And I think one of the ways it can have a most potent ripple effect is to make it ordinary. My Auntie Sheila did not consider herself a medicine woman she was just a woman who raised a family, who was doing what was hers to do. And there's something about it that it's so potent to remember, and to not get caught, I think, in the ego part about it, that it's just remembering who we are. To return to your original question about making that transition from more conventional psychotherapy, talk therapy, into in offering movement medicine and incorporating ancestral healing, ancestral connection into people's work, it's kind of ordinary. It's what our ancestors did without having to think about it. It's just we've narrowed our perspective. And I think the more we can remember, um, and together shift that cosmology of just what we choose to include to remember, um, then the more we can all remember together, because we do remember better together. You know, it's part of the reason why in movement medicine in particular, I love working with groups, because when a group of us set off together to remember who we are, whether it's in a dance or a ritual, um, it just feels so much more potent. So weaving it into life in a way that we're just expanding our sense of the ordinary, I think also makes healing more ordinary, makes healing part of life.
Well, and part of what you're saying that I think is really so profound is when we remember, which is
Mm,
really reconnecting with
yes,
those lost aspects of ourselves, then it as hard as we try to work at it with all these different modalities in this time, when we remember and reawaken, it is the most ordinary way of being. It's coming
yes,
home.
yes, absolutely. I think that's the bit, you know, in terms of the seeking it out here, it's actually it's our true nature,
It's
and
always
it's
been in here.
always been in here. It's just becoming just that little bit more of who we are by remembering what we are connected to, just by being here.
And remembering who we truly are.
Truly. Yeah. Beyond the stories, beyond the narratives, beyond the wounding. Yeah.
Thank you, dear friend,
Oh,
for
and thank you. What a companion on the journey. Like I said, right? It's more potent when we do it together. And for sure, being along with on this journey with you alongside for many years has been a great gift. So thank you.
well, an extraordinary for me, and amazing how it's so many junctures in our lives we've been facing similar challenges, similar experiences, and supporting each other in that.
Hmm.
So, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. If you're interested in contacting Catherine and doing any healing work with her, feel free to go to her website, Catherine-Dunne, DUNNE.com, or email her at Catherine@catherinedunne.com. Thank you.